Thomas Garrett stood in the dusty street of the small Arizona settlement, staring at the $6 in his calloused hand. The coins felt heavier than they should, like they carried the weight of his entire world. Behind him, the sun beat down mercilessly on the rough wooden buildings that lined the street. Around him, people went about their business, but Thomas felt completely alone. $6. That was all the money he had left in this world. 6 months ago, his life had been different. His wife, Catherine, had been alive then. Their home had been filled with laughter, and their 4 children had been happy. The ranch, though modest, had been running well enough. They weren't rich, but they had what they needed. Thomas had thought that was enough. He had thought they would grow old together, watching their children grow up on that land. Then Catherine had gone into labor with their 5th child. Something had gone terribly wrong. The baby, a tiny girl they named Hope, had survived. Catherine had not. Thomas had held his wife's hand as the life drained from her eyes, and in that moment his world had shattered into pieces. The months that followed were a blur of grief and struggle. Thomas tried his best. He really did. He would wake up before dawn, tend to the animals, work the land, and then come home to find complete chaos. His oldest daughter, Clara, was only 12 years old. She tried to take care of her younger siblings and the baby, but it was too much for a child. The house was always dirty. The children were often hungry. Little Hope cried constantly, and Clara would cry too, overwhelmed by the responsibility. The younger children, 8-year-old William, 6-year-old Beth, and 4-year-old Johnny, seemed to forget how to smile. They walked around with sad eyes and dirty faces. Their clothes were ragged because no one knew how to mend them properly. Thomas would find them huddled together sometimes, just holding each other, looking lost. Thomas had tried to hire help, but the few women in the settlement who might have been willing wanted money he didn't have. He had sold almost everything of value just to keep food on the table. The ranch was falling apart because he couldn't be everywhere at once. Fences needed mending. Animals were getting sick. The vegetable garden his wife had lovingly tended had turned into a patch of dried weeds. Every night, Thomas would collapse into bed, exhausted in body and soul. He could hear baby Hope crying in the next room, could hear Clara trying to soothe her with a tired, broken voice. Sometimes he would just lie there, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer they could go on like this. This morning had been particularly bad. He had found Johnny eating dirt in the yard because the boy was so hungry, and there wasn't much food left. Clara had burned the breakfast trying to care for the screaming baby at the same time. William had a fever, but Thomas had no money for medicine. Beth just sat in the corner, not speaking, not playing, just staring at nothing. Thomas had made a decision then. He gathered his last $6 and rode into town. He didn't know exactly what he would do, but he knew something had to change. His children needed more than he could give them alone. They needed care, attention, and most of all, they needed hope. As he stood in the street now, he heard raised voices coming from near the military post. Curious and desperate for any distraction from his dark thoughts, Thomas walked toward the commotion. A small crowd had gathered around several soldiers. As Thomas pushed closer, he saw what everyone was looking at. 3 women stood there, and Thomas immediately knew they were Apache. They wore traditional clothing that was torn and dirty. Their long dark hair was tangled and dusty. But it was their eyes that struck Thomas the hardest. Those eyes held a mixture of fear, defiance, and deep, crushing sadness that he recognized. He had seen that same look in his own mirror every morning since Catherine died. The women were in chains. The oldest looked to be perhaps in her late 20s, her face marked by the sun and hardship but still strong. The second appeared slightly younger, with a harder edge to her expression. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16, and despite her attempt to look brave, Thomas could see the terror barely hidden beneath the surface. A military officer was speaking loudly to the crowd. His voice carried that official tone that men in uniform often used when they wanted to sound important. Thomas caught pieces of what he was saying. There had been a conflict. An Apache village had been attacked. These women had been taken as captives. Now the military didn't know what to do with them. Anyone interested in taking these squaws off our hands? The officer said with a casual cruelty that made Thomas's stomach turn. We've got no use for them at the fort. You can have them for labor, cooking, whatever you need. Make me an offer. Several men in the crowd laughed and made crude jokes that Thomas tried not to hear. He felt sick. These were human beings standing there in chains, being discussed like cattle. Yet even as disgust rose in his throat, another thought crept into his mind. A desperate, impossible thought. His children needed help. These women needed shelter and safety. Could there be a way that helped everyone? Thomas's hand closed around the $6 in his pocket. It was insane. It was probably wrong. But what choice did he have? His children were suffering. Baby Hope needed someone who knew how to care for an infant. Clara needed the weight lifted from her thin shoulders. The younger children needed proper meals and clean clothes and someone who had time to comfort them when they cried. Before he could talk himself out of it, Thomas found himself pushing through the crowd. His heart pounded in his chest. His mouth was dry, but he kept walking until he stood face to face with the officer. "I'll take them," Thomas heard himself say. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, like someone else was speaking. "All three of them." The officer looked him up and down, clearly surprised. "All three? What are you going to do with 3 Apache women?" "My wife died," Thomas said simply. "I have 4 young children and a baby. My household is falling apart. These women need a place to go and I need help. Seems like it could work out for everyone." The officer shrugged, clearly not caring much either way. "What's your offer?" Thomas pulled out his $6 and held them up. It was everything he had. If the officer said no, Thomas didn't know what he would do next. The officer looked at the money, then at the 3 women, then back at Thomas. $6 for all 3? The officer laughed. "Mister, you're either the smartest man here or the craziest. But sure, why not? They're yours." Thomas handed over the money and the officer gave him the keys to the chains. As the coins left his hand, Thomas felt a strange mix of relief and terror. What had he just done? He looked at the 3 women, really looked at them and saw them staring back at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Suspicion, certainly. Fear, definitely. But maybe, just maybe, a tiny flicker of hope, too. He unlocked the chains with trembling hands. The women rubbed their wrists where the metal had cut into their skin. They stood there, uncertain, watching Thomas like he might be a threat. "Come on," Thomas said quietly, gesturing toward his horse and wagon. "Let's go home." As they walked through the town toward his wagon, people stopped and stared. Thomas ignored them all. He had made his choice. For better or worse, he had just used his last $6 to buy 3 Apache women. Now he had to figure out what came next and somehow make everyone understand that this wasn't about ownership. This was about survival. This was about desperation. And maybe, just maybe, this was about finding a way forward when everything else had fallen apart. The wagon ride back to the ranch was painfully silent. Thomas sat up front handling the reins while the 3 Apache women sat in the back among some empty grain sacks. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the creaking of the wagon wheels, the clip-clop of the horse's hooves, and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Thomas wanted to say something, anything, to break the terrible tension. But what could he say? He didn't speak Apache, and he doubted they spoke much English. Besides, what words could possibly make this situation less awkward? He had just bought 3 human beings for $6. No matter how desperate his reasons, no matter how good his intentions might be, that fact sat heavy on his conscience. He glanced back once and caught the oldest woman's eyes. She stared at him with an intensity that made him quickly turn away. There was no trust in that gaze. Why would there be? From their perspective, they had been torn from their home, their village destroyed, their people scattered or killed. Now they had been sold to a white rancher. They had every reason to expect the worst. The youngest one, barely more than a girl, was crying silently. Tears ran down her dusty cheeks, but she made no sound. The middle woman sat rigid, her jaw clenched, her hands balled into fists. She looked like she was preparing for a fight. The oldest kept her eyes on Thomas, watching his every move like a predator watches prey, or maybe like prey watches a predator. Thomas wasn't sure which. As they approached his ranch, Thomas felt a new wave of anxiety. The place looked even worse than usual. The fence was sagging in places. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. The house itself, a simple wooden structure that had never been fancy but had at least been neat, now looked run down and neglected. Weeds grew up around the porch. Laundry that Clara had tried to wash hung limply on a line, some pieces dragging in the dirt. Before the wagon even stopped, the door burst open and his children came running out. They stopped short when they saw the 3 women in the back of the wagon. Clara stood on the porch, bouncing Baby Hope, who was crying as usual. Her eyes went wide with confusion and something that might have been fear. "Pa?" William called out uncertainly. "Who are they?" Thomas climbed down from the wagon slowly, trying to think of how to explain this to his children. "How do you tell young ones that you've brought home 3 strangers, 3 Apache women because you're drowning and this is your last desperate attempt to save the family? These ladies are going to be staying with us for a while," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady and calm. "They're going to help around the house." Little Johnny, only 4 years old and too young to understand the complexities of the situation, walked right up to the wagon with innocent curiosity. "Why do they look scared?" he asked. The middle Apache woman flinched at the boy's approach, and Thomas gently pulled his son back. "Everyone's a bit uncertain right now, Johnny. We all need time to figure things out." Thomas turned to the women and gestured toward the house. They didn't move. The oldest spoke something in Apache, her tone questioning but firm. Thomas shook his head helplessly and spread his hands, trying to show he didn't understand. "House," he said, pointing to the building. "You can sleep there. Food, water." He mimed eating and drinking, feeling foolish but not knowing what else to do. The women exchanged looks, having some silent conversation with their eyes. Finally, the oldest nodded slightly and climbed down from the wagon. The other 2 followed her lead. They moved as a unit, staying close together, their eyes constantly scanning for danger. Thomas led them inside, his children trailing behind at a distance. The house was a mess, as it always was these days. Dishes were piled in the basin. Clothes were scattered on chairs. The floor needed sweeping. Baby Hope was still crying in Clara's arms, and the sound seemed to fill every corner of the small house. The oldest Apache woman's eyes went immediately to the baby. Something shifted in her expression just for a moment. The hardness softened slightly. She said something to her companions in their language, and the middle one responded quietly. Thomas showed them around the small house, pointing to things and saying their English names, feeling more awkward with each passing moment. The cooking stove, though it wasn't working properly. The basin for washing. The table where they ate when they had food worth eating. The tiny room where they could sleep, currently empty except for some old blankets. The women took it all in silently. Thomas could almost see them calculating, assessing the situation. Were they looking for weapons, planning an escape, trying to figure out what this white man really wanted from them? He couldn't blame them for any of those thoughts. Clara had followed them inside, still holding the screaming baby. She looked exhausted, as she always did these days. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her dress was stained and torn. She was trying so hard to be the woman of the house, but she was only 12 years old, and the burden was crushing her. The oldest Apache woman spoke again, this time directing her words at Thomas. Her tone was demanding, not asking. She pointed at the baby, then at herself, then made a rocking motion with her arms. It took Thomas a moment to understand. She wanted to hold the baby. Thomas looked at Clara, who hesitated, clutching Hope a bit tighter. The baby continued to wail, her little face red and scrunched up. Clara had been trying to comfort her for hours with no success. Finally, with uncertainty in her eyes, Clara stepped forward and carefully handed the baby to the Apache woman. What happened next surprised everyone in the room. The woman took the baby with practiced, gentle hands. She adjusted Hope's position, supporting her head just right, holding her close against her chest. Then she began to hum, a low, rhythmic sound that was unlike any lullaby Thomas had heard before. She swayed slightly, a gentle rocking motion that seemed to come from years of experience. Within moments, Baby Hope's crying began to quiet. The desperate wails turned to whimpers, then to tiny hiccups. The woman continued her humming, her eyes closed now, and something in her face suggested she was somewhere else, remembering something or someone from her past. Everyone in the room stood frozen, watching this moment. Little Beth moved closer, fascinated. William's mouth hung open in surprise. Johnny climbed up on a chair to see better. Clara's hand went to her mouth, and tears began to run down her face, but these were different tears than the ones she usually cried. These were tears of relief. Within 5 minutes, Baby Hope was completely calm, her eyes drooping on the edge of sleep. The Apache woman opened her eyes and looked at Thomas. For the first time, something other than hostility or fear showed in her expression. There was a sadness there, deep and profound, but also a recognition. She knew what it was like to care for a baby. She understood this need in a way that transcended language and culture. She spoke softly to her companions. The middle one moved to the stove, examining it critically. She touched the wood box, which was nearly empty, then looked at Thomas and pointed outside to where he kept his woodpile. The youngest, watching everything carefully, began to look around the room, her eyes landing on the pile of dirty dishes. Thomas realized something important in that moment. These women weren't waiting for him to tell them what to do. They were survivors. They were taking charge of the situation in their own way, figuring out what needed to be done and starting to do it. They might not have chosen to be here, but now that they were going to make the best of it. The middle woman found the wood and got the stove working properly, something Thomas had been struggling with for weeks. The youngest started organizing the dishes, separating the truly dirty from the merely dusty. The oldest continued to hold baby Hope, who was now fast asleep, looking more peaceful than she had in months. Thomas's children watched all of this with wide eyes. They had been so used to chaos and struggle that seeing someone actually managing to improve things seemed almost like magic. Thomas cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said, knowing they probably didn't understand the words, but hoping his tone would carry the meaning. The oldest woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she spoke slowly and carefully in heavily accented English. "Baby need mother. You need help. We need—" She paused, searching for the word, "safe." It was perhaps the most honest exchange that could have happened. Everyone's needs laid bare. No pretenses, no complicated explanations. Just the simple truth of desperate people trying to survive. Thomas nodded. "Yes," he said. "Safe, I promise, safe." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and Thomas could read her thoughts clearly even without words. Words are easy. Actions matter. Time will tell if you keep promises. As the sun began to set that first evening, the house already felt different. The stove was working. The baby was sleeping peacefully in the oldest woman's arms. The younger children were actually sitting still, fascinated by these strangers who were starting to bring order to their chaos. But Thomas knew this was just the beginning. Trust would not come easily or quickly. These women had been through terrible trauma. They had every reason to fear and hate him. The fact that they were here at all was born of desperation on all sides, not choice. That night, the three women slept in the small side room, and Thomas heard them talking in low voices long into the night. He wondered what they were saying. Were they planning to leave at first light? Thomas woke before dawn, as he always did. For a moment, he forgot about the previous day. Then he heard movement in the kitchen and remembered. 3 Apache women were sleeping under his roof, and he had no idea what this day would bring. He got dressed quietly and stepped into the main room. The oldest woman was already awake, sitting in the rocking chair with baby Hope. The woman looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept much, but the baby was content and fed. That alone was a miracle. The woman looked up at Thomas when he entered. Her eyes were guarded, watching him carefully. Thomas stopped, unsure of what to do. He had spent half the night trying to figure out how to handle this situation. He had made a decision, but putting it into action was going to be harder than he thought. "Morning," Thomas said softly, so as not to wake the other children. The woman nodded slightly but said nothing. Thomas walked to the door and gestured for her to follow him outside. She hesitated, then stood carefully with the baby and followed, keeping distance between them. Once outside in the early morning air, Thomas could see the other 2 women already awake, standing near the wagon. Nobody had slept well, it seemed. Thomas took a deep breath. This was it. Time to make his intentions clear as best he could with the language barrier between them. He pointed to the women, then to himself, then made a gesture trying to indicate talking, communication. The oldest woman said something to the other 2 in Apache. They moved closer but stayed alert, ready to run or fight if needed. Thomas wished he had thought to learn even basic Apache phrases. Instead, he was stuck with a mixture of English, Spanish words he knew, and lots of hand gestures. He started slow. "You," he pointed to them. "Not slaves, not prisoners." He shook his head firmly. "Free, you free." The women exchanged glances. The oldest one narrowed her eyes, clearly skeptical. "Free? Then why were they here?" Thomas pointed to the house. "My children," he held up 4 fingers, "need help. Baby," he made the rocking motion, "needs mother care. House," he gestured around, "needs work. I," he pointed to himself, "cannot do alone." He pulled out his empty pockets, turning them inside out. No money, nothing, but I have house. Food, safety. He pointed to the house, mimed eating, then crossed his arms in what he hoped looked like protection. The middle woman spoke in Apache, her tone sharp and questioning. The oldest responded, then turned back to Thomas. In her broken English, she asked why we stay. You no own us? No own, Thomas confirmed firmly. You help, I give food and home. You no want stay, you go. Door open. He pointed to the road leading away from the ranch. This clearly surprised them. The youngest spoke rapidly to the others. There was a quick, intense discussion in Apache. Thomas waited, his heart pounding. They could leave right now. They could disappear into the desert, try to find their people. He wouldn't stop them. But if they left, he was back where he started, drowning in responsibilities he couldn't handle alone. The oldest woman studied Thomas for a long, hard moment. Then she spoke carefully. You white man, we Apache. Your people kill our people. Why you different? It was a fair question. Thomas ran his hand through his hair, trying to find words that would make sense. My wife die. I know. Pain, I see you, I see same pain. Same lost. Your people, my people, war not my choice. I just man trying to save children. He pointed to the house where his kids were sleeping. They just children. They no understand war. They only understand hungry, scared, sad. They need help. You need safe place. Maybe we help each other? The woman translated for the others. More discussion in Apache. Thomas could see different emotions crossing their faces. Suspicion was still there, but also exhaustion, hunger, and something else. Maybe the faint possibility that this white rancher was telling the truth. Finally, the oldest woman spoke. We stay, we watch. We see if you true. You do bad, we go. You hurt us, we fight. Fair, Thomas agreed. What I call you, names? The woman hesitated, then pointed to herself. I am Nalin. She pointed to the middle woman. She is Casa, then to the youngest. She is Ithe, Thomas nodded. I am Thomas. Thomas Garrett. He pointed inside. My daughter Clara, sons William, Johnny. Baby is Hope. Nalin repeated the names quietly, committing them to memory. Then she looked down at baby Hope in her arms. This baby need much care, she weak. Need good milk, need warm, need love. Clara tried, Thomas said defensively. We all tried. But Clara's child herself. She know how? I know, Nalin said simply. There was a weight to those two words. A story behind them that Thomas could guess at. She had cared for babies before. Maybe she had lost a baby of her own. Casa spoke and Nalin translated. She say your stove bad. Your food bad. Your house very dirty. Much work needed. Thomas almost laughed, but he could see she wasn't trying to insult him. She was just stating facts. Yes, all true. I am rancher, not houseman. My wife did these things. Now wife gone and I no good at this. Ite, the youngest, spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. Nalin translated. She say your children look lost. Like baby deer with no mother. She asked, can she help them? Thomas felt a lump in his throat. Yes, please, they need someone who knows what to do. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they all went back inside. The children were starting to wake up. Clara came out first, looking surprised to see her father talking with the three women. She had probably half expected them to be gone by morning. Pa? She asked uncertainly. It's all right, Clara, Thomas said gently. These ladies are going to stay and help us. Their names are Nalin, Casa, and Ithe. He pointed to each woman as he said their names. Clara looked at them with a mixture of hope and fear. They're really going to help? If we help them too, Thomas said. We're going to figure this out together. Over the next few hours, something remarkable happened. Without being asked or ordered, the three women simply started doing what needed to be done. It wasn't because Thomas owned them or controlled them. It was because they were survivors, and survivors do what's necessary. Casa took over the kitchen completely. She examined their meager food supplies with a critical eye and made disgusted sounds at the quality, but she worked with what was there. She found some dried beans that Thomas had forgotten about, some wild onions growing near the creek, and somehow produced a meal that smelled better than anything Thomas had cooked in months. Nalin kept baby Hope close, caring for her with expert hands. She showed Clara how to hold the baby properly, how to burp her, how to swaddle her so she felt secure. Clara watched everything carefully, desperate to learn. For the first time in months, Clara's shoulders relaxed a little. The crushing weight of being solely responsible for an infant was lifting. Ithay, despite being the youngest and clearly still frightened, took to the other children like a natural teacher. She couldn't speak their language well, but children have ways of communicating that go beyond words. She showed them hand games, made them laugh with funny faces, and somehow got them to help clean up without it feeling like work. Thomas watched all of this happening and felt something he hadn't felt in 6 months. Relief. Real, genuine relief. But he also saw the signs of trauma and caution. The women never fully relaxed. They always knew where the doors were. They flinched at sudden movements. Casa kept a kitchen knife close while she worked. Nalin positioned herself where she could see anyone approaching. Ithay stayed near the other two whenever possible, seeking safety in numbers. They were helping, yes. But they were also surviving. This was temporary in their minds. They were going along with this arrangement because it beat the alternatives. Not because they trusted Thomas or believed in some happy future. That evening, as they all sat down to eat together for the first time, the atmosphere was strange. Thomas's children kept stealing glances at the three women. The women ate quickly, efficiently, like people who had known hunger and might know it again. Nobody talked much. After dinner, Thomas tried something. He pulled out an old map he had of the territory. He spread it on the table and pointed to their location. Then he tried to gesture, asking where they were from. Nalin studied the map for a long time. Then she pointed to an area to the north. Our village was here. Before soldiers came. Thomas looked at the spot. It was far from any settlement, deep in Apache territory, or what used to be Apache territory. Your family? He asked gently. Nalin's face hardened. All gone. Some killed, some scattered. We were taken. I'm sorry, Thomas said, and he meant it. Nalin looked at him with those sharp, assessing eyes. Sorry, no bring them back. Sorry, no change what happened. Sorry, just word. You're right, Thomas admitted. Words are cheap. Actions matter. Yes, Nalin agreed. We watch your actions. That night, as Thomas lay in bed, he could hear the women talking quietly in their room. He wondered what they were saying. Were they making plans to leave? Were they discussing whether to trust him? Were they grieving for everything they had lost? He had offered them freedom, but what kind of freedom was it really? They were strangers in a hostile land. Their people were scattered or confined to reservations. They had no resources, no money, nowhere to go that was truly safe. Staying with Thomas might be only slightly better than the alternatives, but at least it was something. Thomas realized that this arrangement was more fragile than glass. The first week was harder than Thomas expected, and he had expected it to be difficult. Every morning started with an awkward dance of people trying to share space while not really trusting each other. Thomas would wake early and try to slip out to tend the animals without disturbing anyone. But Nalin was always awake first, already caring for baby Hope. They would nod at each other silently, and Thomas would escape outside where things made more sense. Animals didn't require complicated communication or cultural understanding. The language barrier made everything challenging. Thomas knew a handful of Spanish words, and the women seemed to know some Spanish too, so they had that as a middle ground. Between broken Spanish, simple English, Apache phrases, and a lot of hand gestures, they managed to communicate basic things. But deeper conversations were impossible. One morning, about 3 days in, Thomas came back from morning chores to find his house transformed. The floors were swept clean. The windows, which had been cloudy with dirt for months, were sparkling. Curtains that Catherine had made years ago, which had been hanging sadly torn and dusty, were now mended and washed. Casa was in the kitchen, and the smells coming from there made Thomas's stomach rumble. She had somehow made their limited supplies into something that actually smelled like real cooking. When she saw Thomas staring, she pointed to the stove with pride. Work now, she said in careful English. I fix. Thomas looked at the stove, which had been giving him trouble for weeks. He had no idea what she had done to it, but it was heating evenly now, the smoke drawing properly. Thank you, he said, meaning it deeply. Casa shrugged, but Thomas caught a tiny hint of a smile before she turned back to her work. The children were adapting in that way children do, faster than adults. Little Johnny had completely taken to Ithay, following her around like a puppy. She would teach him little things like how to braid grass or make animal shapes with his hands. Johnny giggled at everything she did, and Thomas noticed that Ithe's scared, haunted expression was gradually softening when she was with the children. Beth, who had barely spoken since her mother died, started talking again, just small things at first, pretty when Ithe showed her a flower, hungry when meals were ready, story when she wanted attention. The women didn't understand all the words, but they understood the need behind them. William, being 8 and feeling like he should be the man of the house after his father, was more cautious. He watched the women carefully, especially Casa, who intimidated him a bit with her stern expression and quick movements. But even William couldn't resist when Casa made flatbread that tasted better than anything he'd eaten in months. Clara was the most transformed. With Nalin there to care for baby Hope, Clara could actually be a 12-year-old girl again instead of a desperate substitute mother. She still helped, but now she had someone to learn from, someone to share the burden with. Thomas caught Clara and Nalin together one afternoon, Nalin showing Clara how to properly swaddle the baby while speaking soft words in Apache that Clara didn't understand but somehow seemed to find comforting. But it wasn't all smooth progress. There were misunderstandings almost daily. Thomas came in one day to find Casa had thrown out some of his preserved food. He got angry before realizing she had thrown it out because it had gone bad and could have made them sick. He felt foolish and apologized, but Casa just looked at him with those hard eyes that said she expected white men to get angry over nothing. Another time, Thomas made the mistake of entering the women's sleeping room without knocking. He just wanted to check on a window he thought might need fixing. Nalin and Casa reacted instantly, defensively, moving to put themselves between him and Ithe. The fear and anger in their faces made Thomas step back quickly, hands up. "Sorry," he said. "I should have knocked. I wasn't thinking." After that, he made a point of always knocking and waiting for permission. It seemed to help a little, but that incident reminded him how much these women had probably endured before coming to his ranch. They had every reason to expect the worst from men, especially white men. The women kept to themselves mostly when not working. Thomas would hear them talking in their room at night, voices rising and falling in their language that sounded like music to him, even though he couldn't understand a word. Sometimes he heard crying, other times something that might have been laughter. About 5 days in, Thomas was mending a fence when Nalin approached him. This was unusual. The women generally stayed near the house, avoiding him when possible. "Thomas," she said, and he was surprised she remembered his name. She used it so rarely. "Yes?" She stood there for a moment, seeming to struggle with how to say something. Finally, she spoke in her careful, broken English. "Why you do this?" "Real reason." Thomas set down his tools and wiped the sweat from his forehead. This was a question he had expected eventually. "I told you. My children need help." "I need help. Many white men need help." "They know buy Apache women. They know treat us like people. Why you different?" Thomas thought about how to answer honestly. "My wife Catherine, before she died, she was always kind to everyone. Did not matter who they were, where they came from. She see person, not just labels." He struggled to find the right words. "When she died, I was lost. I am still lost. But I think, what would Catherine want? She would want children cared for. She would want me to see you as people, not property." Nalin studied him for a long time. "You still buy us. You pay money." "I know," Thomas said quietly. "I do not know if what I did was right or wrong. I was desperate. But I promise you I try to do right now. I try to treat you with respect." "Respect is actions, not words," Nalin said, echoing what she had told him before. "Then judge me by my actions," Thomas replied. Nalin nodded slowly and walked back to the house. Thomas watched her go, wondering what she was thinking. Did she believe him? Did it matter? She was still here, they were all still here, and that had to count for something. That evening, something new happened. Casa made dinner as usual. But this time she made enough that there was actually extra. Thomas and the children ate at the table as they usually did, while the 3 women ate in the kitchen, separate. But after the meal, Casa brought out something special. It was a type of sweetbread made with some honey Thomas didn't even know they had, and some kind of nuts Casa must have found somewhere. She placed it on the table without ceremony and cut pieces for everyone, including the children and Thomas. Little Johnny took a bite and his face lit up. "It's so good." Casa understood the tone, if not all the words. She almost smiled again. Thomas noticed she was doing that more often now, almost smiling. Never quite getting there, but getting closer. "This is wonderful," Thomas said to Casa. "Thank you." Casa shrugged like it was nothing, but Thomas could tell she was pleased. Food was her language, her way of contributing. Her way of maybe starting to feel a little less like a prisoner and a little more like a person with skills that mattered. By the end of the first week, the household had fallen into a rhythm. It was still awkward, still tense in moments, but it was functioning. The house was cleaner than it had been in months. The children were eating regular, good meals. Baby Hope was thriving under Nalin's care, gaining weight and crying less. Thomas noticed small changes in the women, too. Ite was speaking more, trying out English words with the children. Casa had started humming while she cooked, just barely audible, but it was something. Nalin still watched everything carefully, but her shoulders weren't quite as rigid as they had been. One night, Thomas sat on the porch after everyone had gone to bed. The desert was beautiful at night, stars scattered across the sky like someone had spilled diamonds. He could hear a coyote howling in the distance. The door opened behind him and Nalin stepped out. Thomas tensed slightly, unsure if something was wrong, but Nalin just stood there for a moment looking at the same stars. "In my village," she said quietly, "we tell stories about stars. Each one is ancestor watching over us." Thomas looked up at the sky. Catherine used to say something similar, said her grandmother was up there keeping an eye on things. They stood in silence for a while. Then Nalin spoke again. "Your children are good children. They have sadness in them, but also love. Your wife must have been good mother." "She was," Thomas said, his throat tight. "Best person I ever knew." "I had baby once," Nalin said, so softly Thomas almost didn't hear. "Long time ago, he died. When soldiers came to village, my husband died too. I have nothing left of my life before." She paused. "When I hold your baby Hope, I remember my son. It hurt, but also, it helped, you understand?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, I understand. Pain, but also purpose." "Yes," Nalin agreed. "Purpose." She went back inside, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. That conversation, brief as it was, felt important. It was the first time any of them had shared something truly personal. It was trust, just a tiny amount, but more than there had been before. The next morning, Thomas made coffee as he always did, but this time he made extra and brought a cup to the kitchen where Nalin was already up with the baby. He set it down near her without a word. She looked at the coffee, then at him. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," Thomas replied. It was such a small thing, a cup of coffee, but it felt like crossing a bridge. 3 weeks passed, and the ranch felt like a completely different place. Thomas walked back from town one afternoon, supplies loaded in his wagon, and paused at the hill overlooking his property. The fences were mended. The garden, which had been a wasteland of dead plants, now showed neat rows of vegetables. Clothes hung cleanly on the line, actually clean this time. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady stream, meaning the stove was working perfectly. But more than that, he could hear laughter. Children's laughter, real and joyful, carrying across the distance. It was a sound he thought might never return to this place. As he got closer, he could see the source. Ite was in the yard with all 4 children, teaching them some kind of Apache game that involved a lot of running and giggling. Even Clara was playing, and she looked like a child again instead of a tired little adult. Baby Hope was propped up on a blanket nearby, watching everything with wide eyes. Nalin sat on the porch steps, keeping an eye on the baby while doing some mending. She had taken to fixing all their worn clothes, a task that never seemed to end with 5 children. When she saw Thomas approaching, she didn't flinch or look away like she used to. She just nodded in greeting. "Good day?" she asked. Her English was getting better every day. "Good day," Thomas confirmed. "How is everyone here?" "Children happy. Baby strong. Casa make good dinner soon," Thomas smiled. These simple exchanges felt like victories. "I brought supplies from town. Coffee, sugar, some cloth Casa asked for." Nalin's eyebrows rose slightly. "You remember what Casa asked?" "Of course," Thomas said, confused. "Why wouldn't I?" Nalin's expression was complicated. "Most white men no listen to Apache woman. Don't remember what she say." Thomas felt a pang at that. How many times had these women been ignored, dismissed, treated as less than human? "Well, I listen. Casa is best cook I ever saw. If she needs supplies, she gets supplies. That evening, when Thomas gave Casa the cloth she had requested, she actually smiled. Not almost smiled, but really smiled. It transformed her whole face, and Thomas realized she was much younger than he had thought. Her hardness and stern expression had aged her, but underneath she was probably only in her mid-20s. Good, she said, examining the cloth. Make better clothes for children. Winter coming. Thomas hadn't even thought about winter clothes. That was the kind of thing Catherine had handled. But Casa was thinking ahead, planning for the family's needs. The family. When had Thomas started thinking of them all as one family? The language barrier was getting smaller too. Thomas had started teaching the women more English words every evening, and they taught him Apache phrases in return. It became a routine after dinner. They would sit around the table, and Thomas would point to things, say the English word, and they would tell him the Apache word. Spoon, Thomas would say. Beal dutso, Nolan would respond, and Thomas would try to repeat it, usually butchering the pronunciation so badly that even serious Casa would laugh. The children loved these lessons. They were learning Apache words faster than Thomas was. Little Johnny could count to 10 in Apache before Thomas made it to 5. Beth had learned to say thank you and pretty in Apache and used the words constantly. William, still cautious but warming up, asked questions that the adults struggled to answer with their limited shared vocabulary. Where did you live before? Did you have horses? What games did Apache children play? Ethe tried to answer, her English improving rapidly. She told stories of her village, of wide-open spaces and traditional ways. The children listened with fascination, asking more questions, seeing the Apache women not as strange or scary, but as people with interesting histories. One evening, about a month after the women arrived, Thomas was working on a broken wagon wheel in the barn when he heard voices approaching. He looked up to see 2 of his neighbors, Jacob and Henry, riding into the yard. Thomas's stomach tightened. He had been avoiding going to town too often because he didn't want to deal with questions about his household arrangement. But apparently the gossip had spread anyway. Evening, Thomas, Jacob called out as they dismounted. His tone was friendly enough, but his eyes were sharp and curious. Jacob. Henry, Thomas nodded, wiping grease from his hands. Heard some interesting stories about your place, Henry said, getting straight to the point. Heard you got yourself some Indian squaws. Thomas bristled at the word. I have 3 Apache women helping with my household, yes. 3? Jacob whistled. That's quite a setup you got there, Thomas. Must be nice having all that help. The way he said help made Thomas's jaw clench. It's not what you're thinking. My wife died. My children needed care. These women needed safety. We're helping each other. Helping each other, Henry repeated with a smirk. That what we're calling it now? Thomas set down his tools and stood straight, looking both men in the eye. Say what you came to say. Jacob had the decency to look a bit uncomfortable. Look, Thomas, we're not here to judge, but people are talking. You got Apache women living in your house, raising your kids. Some folks think it's inappropriate. Some think it's dangerous. Dangerous. Thomas felt his anger rising. Those women saved my family. My baby was dying and Nalan brought her back to health. My children were starving and Casa feeds them proper meals. They were falling apart and Ethe gives them joy. What's dangerous about that? They're Apache, Thomas, Henry said flatly. There's still fighting going on. Some folks lost family to Apache raids. They don't like seeing you treating them like they're equal. They are equal, Thomas said firmly. They're people, same as you and me. Jacob shook his head. You're going to get yourself in trouble with that kind of talk. And those women, too. There's men in town who'd be happy to run them off, or worse. Thomas felt ice in his veins. Is that a threat? It's a warning, Jacob said. We're friends, Thomas. I'm telling you this so you can be careful. Maybe you should keep them out of sight when folks visit. Maybe don't talk so much about treating them like family. Get off my property, Thomas said quietly. Both men looked surprised. Thomas, Jacob started. I said get off my property. You come to my home and tell me I should be ashamed of treating human beings with decency? That I should hide them away like I'm doing something wrong? No, they're part of my household now, and anyone who has a problem with that can stay away. Henry's face darkened. You're making a mistake, Thomas. A big one. Maybe, Thomas said, but it's my mistake to make. Now leave. The 2 men mounted their horses, Jacob looking regretful, Henry looking angry. As they rode away, Thomas saw movement on the porch. Nalin stood there holding baby Hope. She had heard everything or enough of it. Thomas walked over to the porch, his hands still shaking from anger and adrenaline. "I'm sorry about that," he said. Nalin looked at him for a long moment. "You defend us, why?" "Because it was right," Thomas said simply. "Those men had no business saying those things." "You make enemies for us," Nalin observed. "White men no forget. They come back, maybe with more men." "Let them come," Thomas said, though part of him was terrified of that possibility. Nalin called into the house in Apache. Casa and Ithay came out, and Nalin explained what had happened. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could see their reactions. Concern, fear, but also something else, something that looked like respect. Casa spoke to Nalin, who translated. "She say you are brave man. Stupid maybe, but brave. She say in her village men who defend their people are honored." "You are my people now," Thomas said, and meant it. "You and my children. That's my family. I'll defend my family." The three women exchanged long looks, having some kind of silent conversation. Then Nalin said something that surprised Thomas. "We stay. We fight too if need. We no leave you alone with danger we bring." "You didn't bring danger," Thomas protested. "The danger is from small minds and hard hearts." "Still," Nalin said firmly, "we stay. We protect children. We protect you. Is fair." That night Thomas lay awake worrying. Had he just made everything worse? Would angry neighbors come back? Would the women be in more danger now because of his big mouth? But in the morning life went on. Casa made breakfast. Nalin fed the baby. Ithay played with the children. Thomas worked the ranch. They were building something here, something unusual and fragile but also strong in its own way. Clara came to him one afternoon while he was fixing a fence post. "Pa, I want to tell you something." "What is it, sweetheart?" "I'm not sad anymore," Clara said quietly. "I mean, I still miss Ma, I'll always miss Ma, but I'm not drowning in sad like I was. Nalin helps me understand that it's okay to miss Ma and still be happy, that Ma would want us to be happy." Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. "Your Ma would be so proud of you, Clara." "Do you think Ma would like Nalin and Casa and Ithay?" Clara asked. Thomas thought about his kind, generous wife. "Yes," he said with certainty. "Yes, I think she would have been friends with them. She would have seen them as people, same as I'm trying to do." Clara nodded, satisfied. "Good, because they feel like family now. Is that okay?" "Yes, Clara," Thomas said, pulling his daughter into a hug. "That's more than okay. That's exactly what it should be." Winter was coming, and Thomas knew challenges lay ahead. But standing there with his daughter, knowing his baby was healthy and his children were happy. 3 months had passed since that day Thomas spent his last $6. The ranch looked completely different now. The garden was flourishing, providing vegetables for their meals. The fences were all mended. The animals were healthy and well tended. Inside, the house was clean and warm, filled with the sounds of children playing and sometimes even music, as Ithay had taught them Apache songs. Thomas was in the barn one morning when he heard horses approaching. He looked out to see a group of men riding up, but these weren't angry neighbors. These men wore a mix of military and civilian clothes, and riding with them were several Apache men. Thomas recognized them as scouts who worked with the army. His heart sank. He knew what this might mean. He walked out to meet them, wiping his hands on his pants. The leader, a military officer Thomas didn't recognize, dismounted and approached. "You Thomas Garrett?" The officer asked. "I am."
"What can I do for you?"
"We're here about the 3 Apache women. We have information that you took custody of them some months ago." "That's right," Thomas said carefully. One of the Apache scouts moved forward. He spoke in English but with an accent. "We come from reservation to the north. Some of the people from Nalin's village are there. We heard she and her sister survived. We come to offer them a place with their people." Thomas felt like the ground had shifted under his feet. He had known this moment might come eventually, but now that it was here, he wasn't ready. "The women are inside. Would you like to speak with them?" "Yes," the scout said. Thomas walked to the house, his mind racing. He opened the door to find Nalin, Casa, and Ithay already standing there. They had seen the horses, had heard the voices. They knew. "There are men here," Thomas said unnecessarily. "Apache scouts. They say some of your people are at a reservation. They're offering to take you there." Nalin's face was unreadable. She said something in Apache to the others, and they responded quietly. Then all 3 women walked outside. The conversation that followed was mostly in Apache. Thomas stood back, watching. One of the scouts explained something at length, gesturing north. The women listened intently. Thomas caught some words he had learned. People, safe, home. Thomas's children had come outside too. Clara held baby Hope, who was now plump and healthy, barely recognizable as the sickly infant from months ago. William, Beth, and Johnny stood close together, sensing something important was happening. After a long conversation, the scout turned to Thomas. I explained to them that their cousin is at the reservation. Some others from their village too. Not many, but some. They have place there if they want. I understand, Thomas said, though his chest felt tight. We camp nearby tonight, the officer said. Give them time to think and prepare. We leave tomorrow morning. If they want to come with us, they're welcome. After the men left, an awful silence fell over the ranch. The women went back inside without a word. Thomas stood in the yard, not knowing what to do. Finally, he went back to work, but he couldn't focus. He kept messing up simple tasks, his mind elsewhere. That evening, dinner was quiet. Casa had made one of the children's favorite meals, but nobody seemed to have much appetite. Little Johnny looked like he wanted to cry. Beth kept staring at her plate. William tried to act like everything was normal, but kept glancing at the women. Clara spoke up, her voice shaky. Are you leaving? Nalin looked at the girl with sad eyes. We must think. This big decision. But you can't leave, Johnny blurted out, tears starting to flow. Your family now. Ite reached over and took the little boy's hand. She said something soft in Apache, her own eyes glistening. After dinner, Thomas found himself on the porch again, a place he went when he needed to think. The sun was setting, painting everything in gold and red. He heard the door open and all three women came out. This was unusual. They normally stayed inside in the evenings. They stood there for a moment, and then Nalin spoke. We need to talk with you. Of course, Thomas said, his heart hammering. The women sat down and Thomas waited. Finally, Nalin began, choosing her words carefully. When we come here, we prisoners. We think you like other white men. We think you hurt us, use us, maybe kill us. Thomas nodded, remembering those first fearful days. You surprise us, Nalin continued. You treat us like people. You listen. You protect. You share food, share home. Your children. She paused, emotion catching in her throat. Your children love us. We love them. Casa spoke then, and Nalin translated. Casa say this place feel like home now. She say she no think White Man Ranch could be home, but it is. She say she happy here, first time happy since soldiers destroy our village. Ite said something softly, and Nalin translated that too. Ite say children need us. She say she need them too. They fill empty place in her heart. Thomas swallowed hard. So what are you saying? We saying this hard choice, Nalin said. Our people at reservation. Our cousin there. We should want to go back to our people. That is Apache way. Family, tribe, people, this most important. But, Thomas prompted gently. But, Nalin said, we have new family here too. Strange family. White man, white children, and 3 Apache women. No one believed this can work, but it work. We must decide. Go to reservation with our people or stay here with you and children. What does your heart tell you? Thomas asked. Nalin laughed, but it was sad laugh. Heart say both things. Heart say go to people, but heart also say stay with children. Heart say honor our culture, but heart also say honor what we build here. They sat in silence for a while. Then Thomas spoke. I can't tell you what to choose. This has to be your decision. But I want you to know something. If you stay, it's not because I own you or control you. It's because you want to stay. And if you go, I will miss you terribly, and the children will be heartbroken, but I will understand. You have to do what's right for you. You know, ask us to stay? Casa asked directly. I'm asking you to do what makes you happy, Thomas said. If that's staying, then stay. If that's leaving, then leave with my blessing. You don't owe me anything. You've already given my family so much. The women talked among themselves in Apache for a long time. Thomas sat there looking at the stars, trying to prepare himself for either outcome. His practical mind told him he would manage somehow if they left. But his heart knew the truth. This family, this strange mixed family they had built, it had become something precious. Losing them would be like losing Catherine all over again in a different way. Finally, Nalin spoke. We ask one night to think. We talk more. Pray to our ancestors, ask for guidance. Tomorrow morning we tell you what we decide. That's fair, Thomas said. That night, Thomas could hear the women talking in their room. Their voices rose and fell, sometimes intense, sometimes quiet. He couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the emotion. This was tearing them apart. He thought about what they were facing. If they went to the reservation, they would be with their people, speaking their language, living in their culture. But reservations were often overcrowded, poor, and controlled by the government. Freedom was limited. Food was scarce. Disease was common. If they stayed here, they would have comfort, food, safety, and a family who loved them. But they would be cut off from their people, living in a white man's world, always different, always apart. And the threat from hostile neighbors was real. There was no easy answer. In the morning, Thomas woke to find the house unusually quiet. He got dressed and went into the main room. The children were already awake but subdued, sitting around the table. The women's door was closed. Then the door opened and Nalin, Casa, and Ite came out. Their faces were serious. They had been crying, Thomas could tell. But there was also determination in their expressions. The children stood up, looking scared. Clara held baby Hope tight. Johnny moved closer to William. Beth's eyes were already filling with tears. Nalin looked around at all of them, her family, both Apache and white. Then she spoke. We talk all night, we pray. We think about every reason to go, every reason to stay. We think about our people at reservation. We think about our duty to our culture. We think about our cousin who wait for us. She paused and Thomas felt like the weight might kill him. But we also think about this family. We think about baby Hope who need us. We think about Clara who like daughter to us now. We think about William, Beth, Johnny who make us laugh every day. We think about Thomas who treat us with respect when no other white man would. Nalin took a deep breath. We decide, but before she could finish, the sound of horses interrupted. Many horses. Thomas's blood ran cold. He went to the window and looked out to see about a dozen men riding up to the ranch. He recognized several of them as neighbors and men from town, and none of them looked friendly. Everyone get back from the windows, Thomas said, his voice tight with fear. This was it, the moment he had been dreading, the confrontation he had hoped would never come. What is happening? Nalin asked, moving to look out the window. Trouble, Thomas said, the kind of trouble I was afraid of. The mob had arrived, and the choice the women had been about to make might not matter anymore. Their safety, their home, their future was about to be tested in the worst way possible. Thomas's hands moved quickly, checking his rifle. It was loaded, but he hoped desperately he wouldn't need to use it. Outside, the men were dismounting, their voices carrying through the walls. Thomas recognized several of them. Henry was there, the neighbor who had warned him weeks ago. But there were others too, men Thomas didn't know well, men with hard faces and harder hearts. Clara, take the children to the back room, Thomas ordered quietly but firmly. All of you, stay away from the windows. Pa, I'm scared, Beth whimpered. I know, sweetheart. Just do as I say, but Clara didn't move to go. Instead, she stood straighter, holding baby Hope close. No, Pa, this is our home, our family. I'm staying. Clara, she right, Nalin said, stepping beside Clara. We all stay. We face this together. Casa moved to stand on Clara's other side. She picked up a heavy iron skillet from the stove. We no run, we no hide. This our home too. Ite was shaking, Thomas could see that, but she moved to join the others anyway. Young William grabbed a piece of firewood, holding it like a club. Even little Johnny picked up a broom handle, trying to look brave despite the tears on his cheeks. Thomas looked at all of them, his strange, mixed, determined family, and felt his heart swell with both pride and terror. They were going to face this together, for better or worse. A loud knock pounded on the door. Garrett! We know you're in there. Come out and talk! Thomas took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping out onto the porch. He kept his rifle pointed down but ready. Behind him, through the open door, the men could see his entire household standing together. There were at least 15 men out there. Henry stood near the front, looking uncomfortable. But the leader seemed to be a big man named Preston, who owned a ranch several miles away. Preston had a reputation for being hard and mean, the kind of man who saw the world in black and white with no room for gray. What can I do for you, gentlemen? Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Preston spat tobacco juice on the ground. You can stop this nonsense, that's what. You got Apache squaws living in your house like their family. It's not natural and it's not right. What I do in my own house is my business, Thomas replied. Not when it affects the whole community, another man shouted. There's still Apache raiding parties out there. You're probably feeding them information. That's ridiculous, Thomas said angrily. These women have nothing to do with any raids. They're helping me raise my children. Those children would be better off in a proper home, Preston said, with proper white people, not being raised by savages. Behind Thomas, he heard Nolan suck in a breath. Case's grip tightened on her skillet. Thomas felt his own anger rising, hot and dangerous. You will not speak that way about them, Thomas said, his voice low and hard. These women are under my protection. They're part of my household. And you're on my property without invitation. We're here to give you a choice, Preston continued, ignoring Thomas's words. Send those Apache women away or we'll run them off ourselves. We'll burn them out if we have to. This is white man's country now, and it's time everyone remembered that. You'll do no such thing, Thomas said, raising his rifle slightly. The first man who tries to harm anyone in my household will answer to me. The men shifted uncomfortably. Some looked uncertain. Others looked eager for a fight. Preston's face darkened. You threatening us, Garrett? I'm defending my family, Thomas said firmly. Same as any man would. Family? Preston laughed harshly. Those aren't your family. They're Indians. They're the enemy. No, a voice said from behind Thomas. Clara had stepped forward, still holding baby Hope. Her voice shook, but she spoke clearly. They're not the enemy. Nolan saved my baby sister's life. Casa makes sure we eat good food every day. He teaches us and plays with us and makes us happy. They're more family than you'll ever be. Get back inside, little girl, Preston said dismissively. This is man's business, but Clara didn't move. And then William stepped up beside his sister. Clara's right. They're our family now. You can't make them leave. Beth came forward too, her small voice barely audible but determined. Nolan tells me stories. She makes me feel safe. Even little Johnny moved forward with his broom handle. I love them, he said simply. You're the bad people, not them. The men out front looked taken aback. They had expected to intimidate Thomas. They hadn't expected to face a united front of children defending their Apache caretakers. Preston's eyes narrowed. You've poisoned those kids' minds, Garrett, filling them with ideas about Indians being equal. It's disgusting. What's disgusting, Thomas said, is grown men coming to threaten women and children. You want to fight someone, fight me. But you leave them alone. One of the men in the back spoke up. Maybe we should just go, Preston. These are just kids. Shut up, Preston snapped. We came here to make a point. Then make it and get off my land, Thomas said.